As an extension of my world history notes that I started at the beginning of time, basically up to World War II, I'm talking about things that I've learned about the Cold War, or I am learning about the Cold War. They're not fully formed yet, but I'm sharing them with you. So there's a lot better, more polished shows about the Cold War. But there's a lot of things that I was taught in high school and college that were lies. It wasn't until I got in the master's program in American history that I was taught how to evaluate sources and actually see what people, look at where the person doing the writing came from, what they were thinking. So a lot of things have changed for me. I'm looking at various books like Manley's 20-Year Revolution or Wiedemeyer's General Wiedemeyer's biography, different books like the book about the historians even today that are in denial or are communist sympathizers who lie about the Cold War. It's called Denial, and it's a study by experts who visited the KGB archives in the 90s, who were amazed at how American historians, particularly even like one near here, Shippensburg has an historian who teaches American diplomacy and history. He obviously hates America. He's obviously pro-communist. He just totally disregards all the information that was received from the KGB archives. So last week I talked about Vice President Wallace's visit to China, and Vice President Wallace, of course, as you probably know, in the 30s during the New Deal, he was highly influenced by a Soviet agent who was supposed to be like an expatriate of the Soviet Union, but is actually on the payroll of Stalin. So I'm going to discuss Marshall's visit to China at the end of 1945. Now, the State Department's own pro-communist white paper at the time, the national government, quote, possessed an estimated 5-to-1 superiority in combat troops and in rifles, a practical monopoly of heavy equipment and transport, and an unopposed air arm. Now, the report of the Internal Security Subcommittee related to Chiang's divisions were chasing the communists northward, and the prospect of a nationalist victory was at its highest. We got to remember that from the memoirs of some of the Chinese communist generals and people involved close to Mao who would eventually turn from communism, that the Long March in the late 20s, which you've read about, I'm sure, or heard about in school, was actually Chiang allowed them to escape. And the idea was his son was being held hostage in the Soviet Union, and he was trying to save his son. And so he was trying to do a diplomacy type of thing, let them escape, let some of them escape, and then possibly get his son back. But anyway, that's another story. So it's inconceivable that the nationalists, with all the advantages that they were said to have had, could have been defeated by the communists if the United States had aided them on a scale that we were aiding the American or the Greek anti-communists. Instead of aiding Chiang, however, Marshall cut off all American supplies for a period of 10 months and brought other pressure to bear to try to force Chiang to bring the communists into his government. Even a shipment of war supplies actually purchased by the Chinese, surplus materials on the islands of the Pacific, all that was suspended by Marshall. It was General Marshall's boast, and I quote, "As chief of staff, I armed 39 anti-communist divisions. Now with a stroke of the pen, I disarmed them." He was authorized to grant a loan of $500 million to Chiang, and that was withheld. Marshall instituted truce teams made up of one nationalist, one communist, and one American. And when the communists were really hard pressed, they would agree to discuss truce terms. These discussions gave them time to regroup, bring up supplies, and prepare for new offenses against the nationalists. Marshall and the communists made their supreme effort to get a ceasefire um, when nationalists were advancing toward what was the Kalgan, Kalgan is how it's pronounced, pass, through which the Reds were moving thousands of troops into China and to Manchuria, through Manchuria, where the Russians were waiting to equip them with arms from capture from the Japanese. Now, this was a really important phase in the betrayal of China. There was a treaty signed on August 14, 1945. Chiang had to accept the terms of the Alta Agreement, and the Russians were supposed to recognize the sovereignty of China and Manchuria. The Russians also solemnly promised to support the nationalist government, but they violated this treaty. They refused to permit Chiang Kai-shek to land troops in Manchuria, either at the port of Daren or on Manchurian airfields. Now, the Russians held Manchuria until the Chinese communists could move in, equip themselves with Japanese, Russian, and American Lend-Lease arms, and prepare to conquer China. Now, September 46, the communists told Marshall that a cessation of nationalist military operations against the Khalgan would be a prerequisite to their participation in peace negotiations. Now, Marshall warned Chiang, according to the white paper that I referenced earlier, that if the situation continued to deteriorate, quote, the communists would be driven to seek and be dependent upon outside support, such as Russian aid, which would make the task of peace settlement more difficult. Now, Chiang said that the occupation of Khalgan was absolutely essential to the national welfare. That really just really ticked off Marshall, and he threatened to go home and sever American relations with China. Chiang was alarmed by Marshall's threat. He submitted truce proposals of his own, but the communists rejected them. On October 10th, 1946, the nationalists finally captured the area they were trying to capture, Khalgan. Marshall continued his pressure on Chiang for a truce, and on November 9th, Chiang yielded. He issued an unconditional ceasefire, and that gave the communists the breathing room they wanted. Now, Admiral, I'm going to talk about next about Admiral Cook's testimony before the Senate subcommittee, that how our government disarmed the nationalist Chinese. So that's going to be next. I'm going to stop there. This is things that maybe it's too much detail for you, but it's things I'm learning about, trying to compare the different sources and some other books. So I hope you'll study this yourself. If you come to different conclusions, that's fine. Share them with me. But I'm reading. I'm going to read from different books. I'm going to study different books, cross references, different books, sources, trying to look for primary sources like testimony before a Senate subcommittee or a State Department white paper, things like that. In any event, I hope you'll study and enjoy studying about the Cold War, learning. So much of what I was taught when I was young was just pro-communist BS. And it's time for me to find the truth. Thank you.